Welcome back to Zenith Poker. Today we'll be continuing with the 3-bet pot series between the big blind and the button. And today we're looking at the connected low boards. So first off, we'll have a look at an overview of the flop strategy for, in general, these connected low boards. Sorting by EV, we can see that the overall EV and the overall equity are very much related. Higher EV for the big blind on boards that are less connected, boards that you contain a 2 or a 3 in the fact that there's fewer sets on those particular ranks, and doing reasonably well on boards that contain an ace even though the equity isn't quite so high. And that's mainly because the equity might not be super high on those boards, but the EV is reasonable because of the presence of ace-king. And so the ace-king hand and ace-king and ace-queen will have pretty high EV on an ace, even though the equity is relatively low. The button, on the other hand, will have a lot of ace-x combinations, especially those ace-x suited hands that we discussed in the previous video. Sorting by EVs, there's just a lot of checking throughout. 52.69% checking frequency for the big blind. Overall, these boards aren't the best board type for the big blind, especially with their preflop range. And the reason behind that is not necessarily because of the amount of straights on these boards, but more the amount of sets. So very high frequency of sets for the button, and the big blind will usually want to slow down when they've got a bluffing type hand and draw to make a pair. Also, a lot of the overcard type hands will have missed, and so those hands will want to check and then hope that the button checks back and sees the turn card. And because those hands will be checking at a pretty high frequency, the big blind needs to check other hands such as overpairs in order to protect that checking range, as we'll see. On the other hand, the betting size, so here for this particular sim, we've got 10%, quarter pot, 1/3 pot, half pot, and 3/4 pot. So 5 different bet sizes there, as well as the all-in. And the half pot line is being taken at a 17.62% frequency throughout. On average, the 3/4 pot and the 35%, 1/3 pot, roughly is taken at around 12%. A good variety of bet sizes. So let's just dive into this as 542. This 542 reasonably high for the big blind, even though the equity isn't particularly high. And that shows the difference between sort of EV and equity. You can have a very high EV, but a very, very low equity in ranges that are quite polar. And here, the big blind has a very polar preflop range. And because they've got a very polar preflop range, they're naturally going to have a polar postflop range. The EV of sort of these overpairs is going to be very high, even though their equity isn't particularly strong. So say, for example, you've got pocket jacks on this 542, the equity of pocket jacks is only 73.9% of the pot, 74% of the pot, say. But the EV of pocket jacks is more than the pot. It's at 35.91 out of a pot of 27.5, right? So even though the equity of these hands isn't particularly high on this particular board, like it's not super nutted, it's still got a very high EV. And the reason why is because the big blind can make bets that leverage that equity, right? Can make bets big enough to deny equity from parts of the button's range. So here, there isn't any just open outright jamming on any of these boards. There is some jamming on other board types, but not on these particular board types. And that's partly because of the higher set frequency. Looking at the overall set frequency here for the button, it's only down at 2.7% on the 542. So a set of 5s, set of 4s, no set of 2s, because set of 2s actually folds pre-flop all the time, and the set of 5s and 4s don't necessarily make it in as a high frequency as the other ranks. There are quite a lot of overpairs for the button's range, but those overpairs on average are weaker than the overpairs that the big blind has. So the big blind is going to have the 9s, 10s, jacks, queens, kings, and aces, but the button really is capped at jacks, and those jacks aren't at full frequency, the 10s aren't at full frequency. Really, the sort of bigger overpairs in terms of 9s and 10s, that's really where the overlap is. And you can see that the EV of 9s, even though 9s here for the button has an EV of 18, but 9s here for the big blind has an EV of 26, and that's just got to do with the asymmetry and the polarity of the ranges. The big blind is going to construct a checking range and protect those checks. So let's have a look at that to start off with, and then we'll look at the overall betting range, right? So this checking range, looking at the percentages, is pretty weak. It's weak in the sense that a lot of the pre-flop bluffs that the big blind use in terms of these offsuit type hands, they've just missed, right? These offsuit and Broadway hands, they've just missed this flop, right? Haven't made a pair, haven't really made any kind of draw. A handful of the suited and connected hands have made some draws here. 7-6 an open ender, 8-7 is a gut shot. Some hands have backdoor flushes, like, but a lot of the time you're going to have a hand like Jack 7, 10-7, Ace 7, Jack 9 offsuit. Like, a lot of these hands just have totally whiffed this board, and because of that, these hands will basically want to check and then hope that the button checks back, and maybe these hands can make a pair, right? And then win it straight up. That's where the EV of these hands come from, right? The EV of these very weak hands, in terms of these very weak sort of unmade hands, looking at there, is pretty low, right? If they don't have any kind of additional draw, a lot of these hands are very low in EV, only about 1 or 2 big blinds. But those 1 or 2 big blinds are enough to fight for and should be fought for. How do you fight for this small amount of equity, small amount of EV? You construct a checking range with sufficiently many traps in terms of check raises. The checking range is actually relatively heavy in overpairs, 12.8% overpairs, bunch of top pairs in terms of the S5. But a lot of these overpairs, particularly aces and kings, with a lesser frequency of these other overpairs. Aces works really well as a trap, as we've discussed in other videos, because it blocks ace-x checkbacks on later streets and will essentially be bet into at a pretty high frequency, and so you can go for that check raise. And the reason why is because the button here is going to be wanting to bet pairs for value against ace high, particularly ace king and ace queen high, which will be calling a lot of these bets. So checking range, bet quarter pot, bet third pot. Let's say look at this bet quarter pot line. Kings, aces can sometimes spring for the trap in terms of a check raise, but a lot of the time they're just calling and then seeing the turn, and then either raising the turn or just going for the call down in the cases of aces a lot of the time. On the other hand, these weaker pocket pairs, which still dominate a large proportion of the button's range, go for the raise now because they need to fold out. They need to deny equity from the overcard. So not necessarily fold them out, but definitely you're going to get some of them to fold. Some of them will call, but the overall, if they choose to call, they've had to pay. They've had to pay to do that, right? So pocket tens here goes for this sort of 3/4 pot raise. Jacks going for half pot raise, etc. Right? So let's look at this 3/4 pot. A lot of those overcards are folding. Ace queen just ripping it in. There's a semi-bluff draw. Jacks and tens, the pocket sixes, 6-5. These sets obviously going for the trap in position, difficult to be outdrawn. And the attack pot ratio is going to be pretty low, yeah, about half going into the river. So going into the turn. Going to get jammed on a lot when you've got an overpair. These overpairs are going to call it off, the set snap it off, check, and then these pocket pairs rip it in, and check backs, jam, etc. So pretty straightforward. Smaller raise size, more hands calling, fewer hands just ripping it in to deny equity, see a turn, and then you're gonna get a lot of bets on turn cards. These stronger overpairs, they actually want to get bets in across more streets. Versus the weaker overpairs, I'll usually just want to bet big now and then jam the turn, because the denial component, right, is more important. These hands are going to get outdrawn at pretty high frequencies, so better to deny equity from the overcards now and then essentially stack off against a tighter range compared to these aces, kings, queens. That's less of a consideration. Raise smaller now, force the opponent to continue with more overcards and then stack off later. So if you've got kings, aces, you can go for this smaller raise. More of these overcards have to continue. If, say, for example, if a jack comes, that's not really good for pocket tens, but it's totally fine for pocket queens or pocket kings, right? So pocket kings now going for half pot bet, and all these jack X will continue. See river, jam river for the remaining 20% of the pot. So that's the main idea. On a lot of these boards, there's going to be a betting range on the flop, and then a checking range with a lot of check raises, right? Facing this quarter pot bet, right, the alpha value for quarter pot bet is only 20%, but folding at 29%, all that got to do with the fact that these lose to potential bluffs in the button's range, and the button has some check back, these bluffing hands, king, jack, king, 10 type stuff. And so in order to make these bluffs indifferent, you have to slightly overfold, and that's fine, right? So look at this raising frequency. The raising frequency is close to 20%, and we'll have a look at it overall. If we go check and then quarter pot, This raising frequency overall is once again close to about 20%, right? 51.85 plus 29.9, that's 81%. So you've got 19% remaining raises against that quarter pot bet. You get a check, third pot bet, about 15% there, right? So lots of raising against these bet sizes in the sort of the check raise line. Check, small bet, very tiny bet. There's not a lot of very tiny bets in position. There is some, about 10%, especially on the ace, but not a huge amount. So a lot of the time it's going to be quarter pot, third pot because of this high check raise frequency. Here, for example, third pot, if they go a little bit bigger, you can even just rip it in here with tens for 150% of the pot. Quarter pot, that jam becomes 2x pots, a little bit on the big side, so maybe you want to avoid doing that. But if they start to size up, say your opponent thinks that they're smashing this board, which they haven't, and they do stuff like 3/4 pot bets, like you're gonna just fold everything and then just rip into the opponent when you've got an overbet, right? Because that's just the way to play it. Like all of these three here are equivalent in the solver's interpretation because the line continuing it is an all in anyway, so the EV is going to be too similar to distinguish between these smaller raise sizes and an all in. It's effectively just all in is that particular size there. Similarly, ace king, and you're going to be trapping stuff like aces and kings and use that to protect the remaining floats with the card type hands and just rip it into the remaining pocket pairs. If an overcard comes now, hasn't really done anything, you get jammed on a lot, and ace king is going to be, ace king and ace queen are going to be different. Aces and kings are loving it at that stage because they just win most of the time. Look here, in terms of the range that bets this 3/4 pot, there's no sets or anything here on the turn. Is most of these pocket pairs, and kings are essentially the nuts, even though they don't have 100% equity because there is still a chance that you can get outdrawn. On the other hand, like if he goes bet call and then like a king comes, like you can start to lead. If an ace comes, you just lead, right? Because ace high is the major component of the call range against this big bet, and it's a major component of most of the call ranges. So, like in terms of check, bet, call, like an ace comes, you're going to want to donk because so much of that check call range was ace king, ace queen, high, and so you definitely want to donk here. On this kind of board, ace 2, 5, 4, who cares about the straight? No one has a 3 in their range. Like here, the big blinds 3x hands is king 3, the buttons 3x hands is pocket 3, so it doesn't really matter. There's only 1% and the stack pot ratio is 1.5, so it doesn't matter. What matters is top pair coming in at 35% here for the big blind and 22.9% here for the button. So check call, you make the ace on the turn, just donk because you're ahead a lot of the time. These pocket pairs, which have bet this flop for the equity now, is going to be indifferent. If you've got a strong top pair, you're going to want to get value from weaker pocket pairs and weaker top pairs themselves. Bet call, say 9 river, like a lot of these ace king and ace queens. Ace king just rips it in sometimes. It goes for the check call, blocking this king 9 type stuff, or just bets half pot. Right at this stage on this 9 turn, there is enough sets that you don't want to be betting too big when you've got ace queen. Right, you don't have to go all in, even though like the EV between betting this size and getting jammed on and being indifferent is going to be very similar to just ripping it in yourself. If another card comes, like for example a jack, maybe you can bet even smaller. There isn't that many bet sizes here on the river for this particular line. Can't really tell too much about what exactly the optimal bet size is. It is probably possible to calculate it if you're mathematically inclined, and you can look at the ranges and bet better size accordingly. But a lot of the time you can just bet this sort of non-all-in size. You get value from weaker top pairs and weaker pairs, and if you get jammed on, you're going to be indifferent a lot of the time. Okay, let's have a look at another board just to hammer in some of the concepts. We'll have a look at one of these boards with lower EV. And if you notice on overall the equity is higher on these boards without a flush draw than on the boards with a flush draw. And that's because of the density of the suited Broadway hands in the buttons range. So when there's a flush draw on the board and the board comes three low cards, there's going to be a lot of suited Broadways which are now flush draw and so can be used to defend. So let's have a look at one of these lower equity boards, 8-7-6. 8-7-6, a little bit different. There's a lot more sets and a lot more straights now because of this 10-9 and the 5-4. The 5-4 isn't as big a consideration as the 10-9 because there's a lot of 10-9, but there's not anywhere near as much 5-4. And besides that, you've got some 2 pairs, 7-6 and 8-7. 8-7 doesn't really make it in their pre-flop, but if your opponent's made a mistake, maybe it will. And the sets of 8s, 7s, and 6s are going to be in there at much higher frequency than on the previous board, where the sets of 5s and 4s weren't in there as often. And so because of this high frequency of pairs, sets, 2 pairs type stuff in the buttons range, the big blind really wants to slow down. It's not really making this really big bet with the overpairs anymore, and more opting for a check raise type line. And facing the quarter pot bet, because a lot of the pre-flop bluffs will have actually made a pair now, in the sense that will have made either a pair or a draw, in the sense you've got stuff like ace-7, ace-6, ace-5, 10-7, jack-7, 10-6, king-6, ace-4. Like all of these are either a pair or some kind of draw. Even these 10x hands are a gut shot, right? So king-10, queen-10 is a gut shot, king-9, queen-9, jack-9 is an open-ender. So a lot of those hands are decent draws on this sort of board. And as a result, there's not going to be anywhere near as much folding facing the quarter pot bet. So remember, alpha is 20%, and here we're only folding at 22%. So that means it's not quite as much check back EV for some of these very weak hands. And because there's not a lot of very weak hands, and the weakest parts of the buttons range now start to overlap with the weakest parts of the big blinds range. So here, which is the hand with the lowest equity, right? It's actually this queen, jack, king, jack, right? And that is also the sort of weakest part of the buttons range. And because there's this overlap between what's weak in the buttons range and what's weak in the big blinds range, there isn't as much check back EV when you've got a hand like queen, jack. In contrast to the previous board where king, jack just totally shreds like jack 9, right? On the 5-4-2. There's just no, if king, jack is the bottom of the range, king, jack, queen, jack is the bottom of the range, and you just totally dominate the bottom of the other guy's range, you're going to expect the big blind here to overfold. But here, that's not necessarily the case. The bottom of the ranges are very similar in terms of the weakest hands, and so there's not a lot of check back EV. Because there's not a lot of check back EV, there's not a lot of overfolding. So here against this quarter pot bet, there's a lot of these draws and pairs and stuff are going to be basically continuing, and stuff like ace queen, king queen, ace jack, that they're all going to let it go. In contrast to the previous board, basically all the ace queen and ace jack continued. And here, different hands are continuing at different frequencies. So a lot of these gut shots, overcards, gut shot plus overcard hands like king 10, queen 10, queen 9, jack 9, offsuit, they're continuing at a pretty high frequency. All these hands with the backdoor flush draw as well, continuing with as the raise. Hands like 9s, 10s, they're going to want to go for the check raise instead of 8s. You're going to want to go for the check raise. Top 2 pair, going to want to go for the check raise at some frequency. Because all these hands are going for this check raise, the button can't bet with basically the entire range. You can't just bet the entire range here, because if they do, the range of the bet is just too weak, right? The checking range is weaker than the betting range, right? The betting range has all the strong hands in it, but if they moved all these checks into it, it becomes a lot weaker, right? And so basically going to end up folding or end up with a hand that's too weak going into the turn. So check raise, what's the main check raise size? You've got this third pot, half pot, pocket tens going for the half pot size. The other sort of strong hands like this straight, the set, they're going for a slightly smaller check raise in order to get money in efficiently across the 3 streets. Say, for example, the small raise line, we see a brick on the turn, and you've got the straight 10-9. You're going to want to continue to bet small. So here, like a quarter pot, like it's very difficult to outdraw this hand. Sure, you can outdraw it to a flush, but even in that particular case, like here, the 2 of diamonds where both the flush and the boats come in, right? Because the call ratio is only half on the river, like a straight is still a value bet out of position here with only 56% equity, because there's lots of flushes and boats now. But obviously, if say an offsuit king comes, the straight is essentially the nuts, and rip it in, you're gonna have a really good time getting in the money across 3 streets. But if you've got like an overpair type hand, pocket queens, pocket 9s, pocket 10s, those hands just want to rip it now in the hand here on the turn. But if the board gets a little bit more dicey, those hands are going to want to slow down. In terms of this 9, completing a bunch of straights for both players, 5 completing a bunch of straights for both players, diamond completing the flushes for both players, you're going to want to slow down. Although some of these other pairs with the flush draw still are ripping it in, and without the flush draw going for this block bet and then jamming the river. Okay. One more board, I think. I think we'll look at one of these ace high boards. So like ace 4-2, here this is going to be very similar to the other ace x boards that we look at, but here with these two low kickers, there's the 5-3 straight, but that's not in other players' range. So 5x hand, a 3x hand, they've got a gut shot. There's not a lot in terms of straight draws or whatever going on. So the main component here is the ace, and then the second main component is a little bit of set type hands. What's happening here is that the big blind has the big ace king, ace queen hands pre-flop, and they're just going to want to bet, and then bet the turn, and then bet the river. What do? Bet half pot, no raising, see whatever turn card, bet half pot on the turn. Once again, no raising, and then you get to the river, say another river, very polar line, right? Because it's just brick, right? Very polar line when you got ace king and ace queen. Like ace queen is snapping it off. It's only got 40% equity, right? Because so much of the value line here is ace king, right? It just loses to ace king, getting out kicked, and all these top pairs are folding as well. Shows a little bit of set, a little bit of two pair, and they always win. But there's nothing actually stronger than top pair that's taking this line. Sure, there's a little bit of two pair ace 4, but a lot of that ace 4, basically all that ace 4 is going to be checking all these turns because it blocks the check backs with it wants to basically get bet into. Bet call, check, blocks a little bit of this 5-4 type stuff. Very, very thin sort of thing going on there. Maybe we can see ace 5-3, similar kind of board, similar kind of thing going on. You got ace king, ace queen, just bet. Or it's going for a check raise, right? Once again, the equity here for the big blind is low, 48.21, but the EV isn't too bad. A lot of the ace-x hands that the button has from preflop, like basically all those ace-x has hit now. So you've got 26.3% top pair, a little bit of two pair, a little bit of sets, right? Big blind doesn't have that. Big blind 25.8% top pair, so more top pair, but those top pairs on average actually going to be stronger, but a lot of the ones that check are going to be weaker, right? And the big blind's actually going to have a lot of middling hands here. Like if you check and then you face a bet, if you got these pocket pairs lower than an ace, right? Like a lot of these hands they're just in the middle of the range. So if the big blind just bets all their top pair on the flop, thinks that this sort of ace 5-3 is good for the big blind, which it isn't, the button is just going to essentially bet their entire range because it's just all either ace-x or hands that are weaker than the pocket pairs kings through nines, which was the bulk of the preflop range. If you've got a top pair here on the button, you're going to want to be betting pretty small, right? Here you got 10th pot betting, quarter pot betting, and you're trying to get value from these pocket pairs, kings through eights, which, on an ace-high board, when you've got pocket kings, it's not very nice. These sort of back doors, flush draws, etc., they're all going to continue. 10th pot, like you face a 10th pot bet and you got like king 10, king 9, queen 10, queen 9, like it's difficult to continue. They're only continuing with backdoor flush draws, even though it's a 10th pot bet. Quarter pot folding 31% of the time. So say for example, we look at this sort of 10th pot line, obviously ace king and ace queen going for the check raise at pretty high frequency. Let's say 7, check, 3/4 pot with two pairs, strong top pairs, etc. 3/4 pot. Now these pocket pairs, 8-3 kings are indifferent. The top pairs aren't indifferent just yet, but will be indifferent here on the river facing this sort of river jam. Right, all these top pairs are now indifferent. So top pairs still calling down because they block a lot, but their EV isn't going to be super high, and that's by construction of this river jamming range, which is just going to be a lot of sets, a lot of two pairs, and top pairs are now checking back. Even ace queen, top pair, second kicker is going to be checking back because there's a tiny bit of ace king traps and the ace queen overlap here, which doesn't necessarily raise the flop. So here, ace king with the flush draw, backdoor flush draw, ace queen with the flush draw, backdoor flush draw. That's just going for the check call. Does pretty well at protecting the remaining range from flush draws, etc. Okay, so I think we'll call that the end of the video. In the next one, we'll look at some more lines here between the big blind and the button in the 3-bet pots on these connected low boards. And I think we'll focus more on the turns and rivers that bring 4 to a straight, because that's going to be the more difficult types of hands to play because there's going to be a lot of things going on 4 to a straight. We'll look at that a bit more. and bring forward to straight, and for these boards completing a flush as well. We'll do that in the next video. I hope you learned something from this video, specifically about the importance of defending by constructing good check raising ranges. And I will see you all in the next one. Bye now.